Hi, folks. How are you doing? And welcome to the podcast. So, in this evening's podcast, like we're doing once a month, we're just going to cover the basics. So, this is a quick 10 minutes of the basics of how to reverse type 2 diabetes and the core principles you need to know and understand in order to put your diabetes in remission. Okay, we will start with the first thing, which is the broad kind of principles around what constitutes a low carbohydrate diet or a high carb diet. So, for context, with a carbohydrate based diet, most people take in about 300 to 400 grams of carbohydrates a day. And actually, that's easier than you would think. So, if you're eating bread in the morning or porridge or cereal, and then you're having rice and pasta in the evening, and you're having cereal bars or granola bars and the odd biscuit, and you'd be amazed how easily, cappuccino with sugar, and you'd be amazed how easily you can get up to three, four, even 500 grams of carbs. Less than 100 grams of carbohydrates per day is described as low carb. And then less than 50 grams of carbs a day, 50, is defined as, or broadly referred to as, ketogenic. Now, ketogenic just means to generate ketones, and ketones are fats. So there's ketones that your body will break down. They'll break down fats into ketones. And the name for that is beta hydroxybutyrate, if anyone is interested. And fats are what your body run on in the absence of carbohydrates. And this is an ancient ancestral mechanism which your body has for fueling the body in the absence of dietary carbohydrate. And you might ask the question, well, why do we have an ancient mechanism for running the body on fat? Well, we would have had to develop one through our evolution. We would have had to have an evolutionary way of burning fat for fuel, because if we didn't, we would run out of carbs 10 months a year, minimum 10 months a year, because we would have had seasonal fruits and vegetables. But I mean, not being cross-pollinated and GMO'd and grown in greenhouses and all that sort of stuff. They would have been wild. They would have been rare that we get them. We would have had to fight for them. So there wouldn't have been a year round. There certainly wouldn't have been a regular supply of fruit all year round. We would have had more of a supply of tubers, and there is documentation that we've been known to, as a species, to dig up tubers and things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, and so on. Even at that, wild potatoes and sweet potatoes and wild fruit in general is much lower in carbohydrate than the kind of modern day, or their modern day counterparts, with the kind of breeding or cross-pollination of these sort of vegetables and fruits. They're much sweeter, much higher in carbohydrates than they are in the wild. By way of an example, if you think about blackberries, if you go into an Aldi or a Super Value and see blackberries, they will be sometimes as big as that. And if you go out to the wild and try and find a blackberry that looks like that in the wild, you won't find it. You'll find quarter the size. Same with strawberries. If you ever see strawberries growing in the wild, they tend to be much smaller, and proper wild strawberries are even smaller again. So I'm not talking about, when I say wild, not talking about the ones in a greenhouse that you get from seeds, but the ones that are actually out in the wild that have grown in the wild. They tend to be much, much smaller and more bitter, actually. Some of the big strawberries you see nowadays are like a third of the size of your fist. They can get huge. So again, we would have had, arguably we would have been in a ketogenic state, a fat burning state, most of our evolution as humans up until very, very recently. Within the context of, we'll say, 2.4 million years of human evolution, at least 200,000 or 300,000 years in the current species that we're in. So the last 500 or 600 years, well, really since the Industrial Revolution, so the last couple of thousand years, really, have we had access to breads and cereals and rice and that sort of stuff on a kind of an ongoing basis. So less than 100 grams of carbohydrates is low carb. Less than 50 grams of carb is keto. Now the question comes up then, do I need to be keto or do I need to be low carb? Well, actually, all you really need to do, and we've seen this in our own studies, is reduce your overall intake of processed, refined foods. So if you did nothing else, only say, well, I'm going to move away from breads and cereals, and I'm going to eat more healthy fats and low sugar fruits and vegetables, and I'm going to eat more protein and more animal fats and things like that, you would probably reverse your diabetes. So the broad number that's referred to in the literature for reversing type 2 diabetes is low carb, and low carb is 100. Keto is faster. It would probably put your diabetes in remission faster. But, excuse me, I'm not a huge advocate for this sort of following a keto diet strictly, and I ate an apple, therefore I'm out of ketosis and I'm off the diet. That's a crazy way to look at anything. That's like saying I want to exercise 5 times a week, but I only exercise 4 times this week, so I'm off the exercise plan. That's no way to look at it. This sort of binary all or nothing approach to anything to do with your health is not a good way of viewing it. It's not a good lens through which to view your health. And the same with diet and carbohydrates. So I would say remove the processed, refined, ultra processed, sugary stuff, the granola bars, the cakes, the cereals, the breads. Remove that stuff. Eat more of the eggs, avocado, meat, real food, nuts, seeds, all of that sort of stuff, and you will get dramatically better. But don't count calories, because it can bring you to a place where you start kind of putting yourself down if you did have the granola bar or whatever. And your health exists on a spectrum. Once you're doing 80% right 80% of the time, you're going to get a lot of the benefits. You're going to get 80% of the benefits. So it's not an all or nothing thing. So less than 100 grams of carbs is low carb, just for reference. Less than 50 is ketogenic. With the studies that we published as far back as 2017, we told people just to have, whole foods, and they happened to come in at about 120 grams of carbs. That elicited a 48% reversal rate in type 2 diabetes, or remission rate, I should say. Blood pressure went down about 11 millimoles of mercury, which is the same as kind of one blood pressure medication, so a lot. Liver function got a lot better, cholesterol levels got better, overall inflammation got better, and people felt great. Okay, so that's that. The next concept to understand, and this is really important, is that all carbohydrates turn to sugar. I can't emphasize this one enough. I can't tell you how many times I've had patients say to me when I do consultations, or if I meet people when I'm doing health assessments, and they say, I have type 2 diabetes. My HbA1c is just, if it's above 48, you're diabetic. If it's below 48, you're not, once you're off medications. They said my HbA1c was 70. I gave up all sugar. I ate absolutely no sugar for 6 months. I went back and my HbA1c was the same, because they missed the point that all carbohydrates turn to sugar. And we have this notion that fruit is healthy and whole grains are healthy and porridge and Weetabix and or wheat-based cereal. Sorry, I'm not using any particular name. Weetabix is no worse than any other wheat-based cereal. But those sort of, flaked corn cereals and so on, that they're good for you somehow, especially if you have them with low-fat milk. Nothing could be further from the truth. All of those types of foods will leave you with between 10 and 15 spoons of sugar in your blood. So if you look at the chemical composition of a carbohydrate, the molecular composition of a carbohydrate, they are chains of sugar holding hands like this. And even if you look it up on Google, look up a carbohydrate and then look up glucose, and glucose is sugar. A carbohydrate is chains of sugar holding hands, chains of glucose holding hands. And when we digest carbohydrates, all digestible carbohydrate is metabolized as sugar. So porridge, cereal, breads, even brown bread, bananas, potatoes, all of that stuff ends up as a large quantity of sugar in our blood, which goes on to damage our small blood vessels. So it's not enough, unfortunately, to follow a low sugar diet. It has to be a lower carb diet, and we're avoiding the kind of processed carbs. Don't worry too much about calories. So the next point is that calories are not all equal. So this notion that something is low calorie or diet or low fat and that's better for you, that whole approach and way of looking at health and way of looking at managing obesity, I mean, all we need to do is look around to realize that failed miserably over the last 30 odd years. So we have a nation of 60+% of us overweight or obese buying almost exclusively low-fat foods. It hasn't worked. And the reason it hasn't worked is that the main driver of body fat is a hormone called insulin. Insulin spikes when you eat carbohydrate and sugar, not when you eat fat and protein. So I always say that we should hop on a bus, hop on a plane, and we should go over to the plains in Africa, to remote tribes around the world. And 60% of us, by the way, will be obese, overweight or obese. And we should tell them that they've got it all wrong. We have the solution. You eat low-fat foods. And they would stand there with their spears and their six-packs and laugh us off the place that they live. They would laugh. And the same way, if you could go back now in time, we could go back 100 years and tell your grandparents or your great-grandparents even that the bacon, the fat on the bacon and the strawberries and cream they were having and the lamb that they were having 2 or 3 nights a week, that was really bad for them and it was going to make them fat and give them heart disease. They would find it hilarious. Absolutely hilarious. So one set of us has it right. There's an ancient ancestral wisdom in these remote tribes and in our great-grandparents. And the rest of us, unfortunately, have been victim to various different things, including misguided research and public health guidelines. So, excuse me, if we're not eating fats, what are we going to eat? Excuse me, if we're not eating much carbohydrate and sugar, what are we going to eat? Well, we swap out the glucose, the lots of glucose in our blood, because of course we don't want that with diabetes, and I don't want that for my patients, with fat, healthy fat. So things like cream, butter, cheese, meat, avocados, chia seeds, dark chocolate, nuts, all of that sort of stuff. So either animal or plant-based fats, there's neither are better than the other, really. They're all really good. They'll help your body to produce ketones, which are the fats that your body will run on in place of glucose if you don't have glucose coming in. But don't go mad on fats if you want to lose weight. So the reason I say that is, if you say that my carbs are relatively lower, I'm keeping my processed carb intake down, I'm not eating junk food anymore, and I'm eating more fat, your body will say, we're not running on glucose anymore, we're running on fat. But if you give it loads of dietary fat, loads of exogenous fat, as we call it, outside fat, like cream and cheese and nuts and that sort of stuff, your body will say, well, why would I bother burning body fat if you're giving me loads of dietary fat? So sometimes you see this with patients where their weight loss will stall all of a sudden. They lose a lot of weight in the first week and for the first 3 or 4 weeks. And then all of a sudden, their body will say, you know what, I'm happy to burn this dietary fat. And often when I kind of break it down with what patients are eating, it's the usual suspects. Not always, but the usual suspects are cream. What's the other one? Cheese and nuts. They're the three. So people snacking on nuts. I had a patient once, I won't say his name, but he was eating a packet of pecan nuts. And he was saying, would that be it? And I started eating a packet of pecan nuts every day, a big packet from Aldi. And I was saying, possibly, yeah, because I was being sarcastic. I said, because you're eating 1,600 calories in pecan nuts alone on top of your 2,000 calories a day. So again, why would your body burn body fat if you've got that much fat coming in? Now, you definitely don't want to go low fat or zero fat. You do want to have those foods in it. Just be careful not to overdo it. Now, if you go very low carb and you go very low fat, you end up in a state known as rabbit starvation. So basically, you've given your body no fuel. If you're going lower carb, lower sugar, lower processed food, you must go high fat, but just be careful not to go way over the top. That's just a little word of warning. And then finally, reduce your meal frequency. So the idea that we should eat little and often has basically been predominantly propagated by the food industry. This sort of, don't forget your 11s and you have to have that snack at 3 p.m. and to keep you burning fat. That makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. And I had a talk I did once. This is a good few years back in the corporate world. And someone said to me, everyone knows, if you don't eat every 2 or 3 hours, your metabolism slows down and you gain weight. And I said, really, can you explain hunger strikes to me? You don't gain weight when you stop eating. That makes no sense whatsoever. So the idea was to keep your blood sugar levels up, to keep them balanced, and that will help you with weight loss. And that's a nonsense science. It makes no sense at all. Less frequent meals. So reducing your meal frequency, eating once or twice a day in bigger meals, will elicit way more fat loss than eating the exact same day's food over 6 or 7 smaller meals. So reduce your meal frequency if you want to speed up weight loss. And then finally, and I'll leave you on this one, guys, when it comes to can I eat XYZ food, the real question to ask here is when we're dealing with type 2 diabetes is essentially carbohydrate intolerance. Your body is intolerant to carbohydrates. Some people even argue allergic to carbohydrates. So we want to minimize the amount of carbs and so reduce the impact on our blood sugar levels. So the question is, if you're wondering, can I eat cashew nuts, for example? People send me these things all the time. And I always go back to them and say, if they say, can I eat cashew nuts? There's 40 grams of carbs in them. And I always say, does that fit into your goal amount of carbohydrates in a day? If your goal amount is 50, you probably don't want to be eating 40 grams of carbs if you're trying to be keto. It's pretty much all your carbs gone for the day if you're trying to stay within that limit. And again, I'm not a fan of those limits. Broad stroke approaches of eating healthy and just removing refined carbs is a much better approach. If you have 100 grams, maybe it'll work for you, but it's still a lot to be taken in at one time. So if you're asking the question, does this fit into, can I eat this food? Ask the question, does it fit into my daily allowance of carbs? Whatever that is for you. It could be 150, it can be 120, it can be 100, it can be 50. It doesn't really matter. As a general rule, if you're moving away from processed carbohydrates and you're avoiding bread, cereal, granola bars, rice, and pasta, you're not really going to go too far wrong. So I wouldn't sweat the small stuff. So sometimes people say to me, what about this sauce or what about this seasoning? Have a look at it and see how much. And here's the key: carbohydrate is in it, not sugar. Because if you look up carbs, if carbs are high, sugar is probably going to be high anyway. And even if it's not, because they are separate things, all carbohydrate converts to sugar in your blood anyway. So essentially, consider carbohydrates the same thing as sugar. So hopefully that's given you a quick rundown of the basics. So just to do a quick recap on those, less than 100 is low carb, less than 50 is keto. All carbs turn to sugar. Calories are not equal, so don't worry about eating high calorie foods. You can still lose weight if they are low carb foods. Be careful with fats. Don't go mad on them. Don't have tons of them just because you can eat them. Reduce your meal frequency. So, introduce a little bit of intermittent fasting. And I'll cover that in a separate topic in a couple of weeks' time. And if you're wondering, can you eat a food, just see can you fit it into your kind of daily allowance that you've set for yourself in terms of carbohydrates. Hope that's been helpful. And thanks for watching. If you haven't already subscribed, please do. It helps us more than you think. Have a good evening and I'll see you all soon. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.